Welcome to the second edition of the seminar series on Sephardic Thought and Modernity, co-sponsored by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University and the Bilsberg Program for Israel Studies at University of Calgary, and organized by Yuval Ivri and myself, Angie Cohen. We want to thank Anna Simpson, Karen Goodblatt, and Sean Lindsay for their work behind the scenes to make this seminar possible. It is a pleasure for us to see this conversation grow and include more interlocutors and more participants. This seminar series intends to continue the exploration of Sephardic modernities we initiated in 2021, when we held a dialogue with different researchers on the importance of the Arab-Jewish historical experience, the concept of Masortiut cultivated in the Sephardic world, otherness, Jewish elites' monopoly over knowledge and authority, the specificities of Jewish subjectivity in the colonized Levant. All these themes marked different directions and points of reference of an intellectual map that we would like to continue to both build and follow in the second edition of our seminar series. Our intention is to focus on the question of continuity and rupture as a way to deepen our dialogue about the different forms that modernity has adopted throughout Sephardic history. We will discuss questions such as the meaning of the concept of modernity in non-European contexts. We will explore how non-European Jewish societies developed ways of life and practices that synthesized tradition, change, and cultural diversity throughout time. We will delve into Sephardi intellectual life, cosmopolitanism, cultural belongings, language, translation, and mobility. Following a long tradition of transnational connections and mobility, both intellectual and geographical, this will continue to be an international forum where different disciplines and peoples meet. The perspective of the series, facilitated by the presenters' lines of research, encompasses literature, ethnography, sociology, political history, musicology, cinema studies, comparative history, etc. We have chosen the format of a dialogue, either among two speakers or among one speaker and the organizers. The idea is to move beyond the traditional format of frontal lectures and share thoughts and inquire together into questions that are relevant for all of us. This dialogical approach assumes that we all get to texts and ideas with our own concerns and questions, which change over time. Being able to share and discuss the perspective from which we, speakers, organizers, and participants look at history and culture will hopefully contribute to weaving a shared, multifaceted perspective and discourse. The seminar will be structured in the following way: 45 minutes of presentation and half an hour of Q&A. Dr. Sabrina Perich, whom we thank for her continued support, will be moderating the chat. So you're all welcome to write your questions there. If someone wishes to open their microphone and ask their question, you're more than welcome to do so. Just make sure that you let the moderator know in the chat and wait for your turn. Our second edition is being inaugurated by Professor Ammiel Alcalay, who has had an enormous impact on the way we look at the Arab Jewish world and the way in which historical time may be analyzed. And now Yuval Ivri will present Ammiel Alcalay.
Okay, thank you very much, Angie. I'm really, really excited to be here and to start this series, and definitely to start it with Professor Ammiel Alcalay. So I will introduce him first. Poet, novelist, translator, critic, and scholar, Ammiel Alcalay teaches at Queen's College and the Graduate Center, CUNY. His books include After Jews and Arabs, Memories of Our Futures, Islanders, Neither Wheat Nor Gold, and Little History. Recent books included the co-edited A Dove in Flight and the New York Translation Collective, a poem sequence, Ghost Talk, and a bibliography for After Jews and Arabs, which will be at the center of our conversation today. His translations include Sarajevo, a war journal, The 10th Circle of Hell, and Sarajevo Blues, as well as Keys to the Garden, New Israeli Writings, and a co-translation with Oz Shelach of Outcast by Shimon Balas. He is a contributing editor of the Markaz Review and was given a 2000 2017 American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation for his work as a founder and general editor of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetic Document Initiative. Ammiel, this is really, really a great, great pleasure to have you here with us and to open our series with this conversation. I think there is no one else more fit to do that, dealing with the question that we are dealing in this series, and I think in the previous one as well. So the starting point of our discussion today will be your recent book, a bibliography for After Jews and Arabs, and I think that you can find in the chat a link to where you can either buy the book or download it free as a PDF. This book revisits your seminal book After Jews and Arabs that was published around 3 decades ago in 1993. Alongside the publication of the full bibliography of the project, this is a wonderful, wonderful thing for researchers and others that are interested in this issue, which was not included in the original book. It also included 2 fascinating essays, which reveals the behind the scenes of the production and the publication of the book. It's a reflective and personal essays in the tone of their writings, and allows us a unique and rare exposure to the evolving process of this mighty and influential research project, as well as to the tedious and complex acceptance stages until the publication of the book about 5 years after its completion, and you deal with it and about this process and about the resistance of this kind of publication in that time. So I want to begin with a question about your reflection and thoughts about the state of knowledge and scholarship on Sephardi modern culture during the time of your writing and publication of the book, roughly between 1988 to 1993, and maybe to look at it in comparison to the state of knowledge today. Your book has created definitely a paradigm shift in the way we research and analyze modern Sephardi culture and Jewish culture in the Middle East, and more specifically Mizrahi culture and literature, and many artists, writers, scholars were influenced by this work, definitely me and Angie included. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the transformation in scholarship that happened since then. So if you can start with the state, of the scholarship back then, and why this book was being accepted in this kind of resistance, and what happened since then in reflection to this book.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Yuval and Angie. And I'll just preface my remarks by just saying I want to thank Yuval particularly, but also Deborah Starr, who helped coax me into participating in certain things. We did a seminar on Shimon Balas that was extraordinary. And then when the bibliography came out, I did an event with Gil Anijar, which was also fantastic. And so I'm very happy to keep processing this material because, in fact, I didn't have much of a chance during those years. So I know that Yuval said you'd open with a few questions that I can consider broadly. I want to backtrack a little bit, even from those dates that you said, to try to give you some sense of what I think I was up against and others, and what the historical context was for that work. And I wanted to start with a quote that I love. I keep coming back to it. It's just very brief, by Abdallah Laroua, who's a Moroccan historian. He says, "We often make our first real reading of an author, not when we would simply desire to do so, but when conditions demand it." Okay, and so one of the things that's very important in my work, and I'm sure it's true for a lot of people, is where do you find leverage? Where do you find the leverage that will bring you into some endeavor or some work that you think can further issues, open things, explore things, discover things, etc. Okay, now I think I walked into a very particular historical window. Okay, and I want to just say a few things about that. In 1977, as I'm sure people know, the Menachem Begin and the Likud party won the election in Israel. It was a seismic shift. It was an absolutely seismic shift, and particularly for the Mizrahi question. And if one can kind of transpose a little bit, the general attitude of mainstream Israelis was equivalent to the way kind of white liberals now think of Trump supporters, 24/7 hysteria, absolute loathing and contempt, and very fraught atmosphere, okay? And this is roughly when I began my work in that period, okay? And I think the more I think about it, the more I realize I think it would have been impossible to even approach that work if that seismic political shift hadn't happened. Because all kinds of things that had been suppressed were bursting at the seams everywhere one looked. And so if I carry that further, I take 1977 to the early 1990s, okay, where you have a series of events. The Soviet Union dissolves at December 25th, 1991. Just prior to that, there had been the Madrid talks, which were really emerged from the first Intifada, which I was very much present in and very involved in. And it was a singular experience for me. It transformed my thinking, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Within that period, you have a whole bunch of other very important events. You have the capture of Mordechai Vanunu, the Israeli nuclear technician who was from Morocco. And that also was a kind of bomb exploding in the culture and in the society. I was involved from 1984 to 1986 in a project that in many ways preceded but encompassed the work on After Jews and Arabs, which was continual really from the early 80s, in an oral history project, which the ostensible purpose of the project was to ascertain what the attitudes of Mizrahi Jews are about, quote unquote, the peace process, or Palestinians in general. And the atmosphere was such that I realized that the way the interview was done would completely determine what the responses would be. And many Mizrahi Jews, we're still talking about a time in the 1980s when there were a lot of people with living memory of their lives in Iraq, in Morocco, in Egypt, wherever they were from. And many people used that experience as a way of asserting their Israeliness, And so I reversed the whole process of the questioning. I began to ask people, what is your native language? So, and I calibrated, there were about 100 people, in-depth interviews. There were about 1,200 pages of transcribed interviews. And the first question was, what is your mother tongue? What's your native language? So that way I could corroborate generationally. If somebody had grown up in a household where they spoke Arabic, but the child didn't because they were embarrassed or whatever, or people who grew up with Arabic as a native language. So most people said Arabic. So the next series of questions, oh, okay, where did you live? And they said, well, I lived in Cairo. And, I said, well, what was it like? What was it? So people start telling their life story, essentially. That's the first part of the interview. Second part of the interview is, so when did you come to Israel? So they came in X, Y year, whatever. What happened then? They sprayed us with DDT. They put us in transit camps, etc. So you get that story. Third part, you're the prime minister. How would you deal with this situation? Universally, people said, it's not a problem. You treat people with respect, find a way to talk to them, etc. The word security, which is such a pervasive word in the Israeli vocabulary, came up once in 1,200 pages. And that was from somebody who worked in the security services, who was an interrogator, actually. So anyways, that was a very, very important aspect of how I thought about the material. So coming to this book that Yuval mentioned, the Bibliography for After Jews and Arabs, I can't tell you how happy I am to have been able to do this book, because it's the first time really that I've been able to personally narrate this whole process, but also find another point of leverage into this material. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But what I want to say is, in that period, I cannot even begin to overemphasize the extent to which there was absolute antagonism, difficulty, struggle with presenting, exposing, championing, even commenting on any of these people's works, cultures, worlds that they came from. It was completely fraught. It was just attack, attack, attack. You can see some of that in those readers' reports on a more genteel level, but I'm talking about absolute constant antagonism and propaganda. It's people are barbarians, they're primitive, they're blah, blah, they have no culture, et cetera, et cetera. All of that. So that, you know, that was a real struggle. And, you know, I guess this is just the way I am, but I chose to continually record and expose this struggle, you know, and certainly some of those decisions, you know, determined, I mean, since After Jews and Arabs, I have never published with a university press, for instance, because I did what is completely verboten, you know, to publish my readers' reports and my commentary on them. But I did that only as a last resort in order to try to coax these people into a debate, into an actual open debate. And, you know, so I guess what I want to emphasize here is that at all points, this bibliography and all the materials in this bibliography were things that, because of the political and historical and cultural pressures of the time, had tremendous leverage. They were so suppressed, they were so marginalized, they were so forgotten, that anything that came up immediately could have a certain reverberation or implication or ability to perforate, you know, the surround sound of how things were being conceived. So that was very important. So constantly my thoughts have been with, you know, the relationship of experience to administration, okay? And how experience is always a test against administration, you know, against administered knowledge, against administered, you know, I mean, don't even get me started with what we're facing now in terms of scientific data. You know, we have the person who holds 9 patents on the mRNA vaccine process who's banned from Twitter. So that's where that gap is now. And so I kind of lived through an early process of watching how an authority could judge with no proof.
Yeah. By
being, you know, judgmental and authoritarian, not authoritative, you know. So the struggle to get this work in the context it needed to be was very, very difficult, as were the work that came on Keys to the Garden, actually getting the literature, which was really my initial desire in this whole process, was to get this material in the world so people could judge for themselves and read it. And I've come to the conclusion that Mizrahi literature is really one of the most marginalized and repressed and suppressed literatures that I'm aware of. And I have wandered quite a bit in, you know, marginalized literatures, and it's quite extraordinary to see to what extent.
I think that only to bring to the audience that doesn't know, and I really, really highly recommend to read to Arab, Jews and Arabs. I think it's the single most important book on a modern Sephardi thought, but of course on Middle Eastern culture as well. But I think that exactly what you said, I think for me, when I read it first in the end of the 1990s, it was struck me how you, first of all, that it's very, it's situated in the current political situation of the Mizrahi Jews in Israel, Palestine. In the same time, you give a long durée of the Sephardi intellectual heritage or history, going back to Al-Andalus and going back again to the modern 20th century Middle Eastern culture and to Arabic and Hebrew. So I think that part of the resistance to this book, it's because it in many ways you transgressed every disciplinary boundaries that were built that in many ways detach the modern Mizrahi Jews in Israel from the Al-Andalusian Jewish heritage in Spain. So between Maimonides and the Mizrahi Jews didn't have any connection anymore. And you again build again this kind of a long durée. So I think both of the things together I remember struck me very strongly. And I think it was the first documental that worked with writers that nobody wrote about them even in Hebrew. People like Shimon Balas and Samir Nakash, and even living authors that you were.
Some aren't even published in Hebrew. Tikva Levi. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Yuval. That and one of the things that I talk about in the Poetics of Bibliography essay that opens the book is. Is there a problem? Oh no, I heard somebody.
Oh no, sorry. I just wanted to ask a question, but I can wait.
Oh, okay. So is this disciplinary question, which was, by any academic standards, I had no right to do this work. It was crazy for one person. You need an institution. I mean, I had to study economics, musicology, architecture, urban development. You name it, to try to wrap my head around this. But again, I want to stress how the pressures of the present that I was involved in, which was very on the ground. I mean, there were political organizations, there were, there were the Intifada going on, there was, extraordinary amount of activity and pushing through of things that had been so suppressed, completely informed how I looked at the past, how I looked at the past, because it suddenly activated all of that. And it made it necessary to connect. I mean, you have a situation in Israel still today, I think, which is extraordinary. Okay, you cannot go into a store and get like a paperback edition of a Ibn Gvirol, Yuda Levi, Ibn Ezra, not to mention somebody's so-called minor like Israel Najara or other poets. This would be in English as if, no Shakespeare, no Milton, no Shelley, no Blake, no Keats. Just you can't find it. You have to go to a particular library to get an old edition, etc. So there is a real cutoff there that you mentioned. Yeah, Angie, you wanted to say
yeah, it was with regards to the question of let's say this dominant discourse that not only marginalizes Mizrahi production, but also the very possibility of conceiving time in a different way and accessing sources and putting them together in different ways too. And if you dare to do such a thing, then you are either an artist, if we're not an academic, or I don't even know what one becomes when one does such a thing. And so what I remember experiencing when reading After Jews and Arabs was like a validation of a possibility that I didn't even know it was legitimate. I didn't even know that one could do such a thing, because the whole reconceptualization of time came together with the validation of a historical experience that could not be understood through the, let's say, European, Western, whatever, conceptualization of time as something that tends to progress and go from primitivism to enlightenment and then postmodernism.
Yeah.
This whole, so we were talking about historical experiences that whose actual understanding required a different approach to time. And you did that in after Jews and Arabs with these like different categories that you proposed.
So
I was wondering if you could say something about that today.
Absolutely.
How do you think about it?
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. I'll say quite a few things about that. Okay, there's a reason why that, why that essay is called The Poetics of Bibliography, because, I'm somebody of a generation that still, started reading poetry through Ezra Pound, and cantos as a poem, all times are contemporaneous, and a poem that includes history. And that follows then with Charles Olson, who's a very important figure for me, another poet whose meditations on history are extremely important and very, very useful. So for instance, one can go to a quote from Captain John Smith, "History is the memory of time." And I've spent a lot of time reading historiography, thinking about history from, people like Momigliano to, all kinds of theorists on history and how one can think about time and apportion it. And a book that has been very, very influential for me is a book called The Shape of Time: Remarks on the History of Things by George Kubler. George Kubler was an art historian whose specialty was Mesoamerica. And he's somebody who spent his life, looking at tens of thousands of objects and trying to figure out what the hell they meant, in sequence, in production, and so forth. And it's a book that he wrote toward the end of his life, and it's absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that's very important there, he says, we would have had a much better handle on things if our model was not biology but electromagnetism. Okay, so where you have relays and networks and kinds of things like that, rather than the kind of Linnaean taxonomies, that we have, the life and death, et cetera, of a culture. He talks about a work of art being a star, which is dead, but the light, it still emanates light. Things like that, very suggestive, but also his ability to think about different velocities of time, different velocities of time. So that this period that I was in, the velocities were off the charts. I mean, things were just moving at, very quickly, and paradigms were changing and attitudes were changing and things that had been, so that's very important, is what is the context of happening? What speed is it happening at? And one of the things, I just want to say this, that a point where I found real leverage in doing this bibliography book is the fact that this bibliography is an analog bibliography. This is pre-digitization, okay? And I left it just as it was. And I think it's a very important discussion to have, because I know that the actual experience, the organization of this is very different than what comes out of the digital world that scholars are now working in, because it involved so many human encounters, small collections, private collections, little libraries, things that people gave me, things that, not to mention just the physicality of handling books, seeing what they looked like, where they came from, who might have owned them, what's next to them is most important. What else is on that shelf? We can digitally now, we can find anything, but we can't find things we're not looking for. It's much harder to find things we're not looking for. Those chance encounters that suddenly open up all kinds of other options and possibilities. So there is a meditation on that in this book, and I think it's a very, I think it's an opening into things that people are thinking about. But as in all my work, I work from the details of my experience of it. so that the theory is completely embedded in the narrative of how it happened and what was involved in its happening. And so it's a very different approach. It's a very different approach. I think this book is germane to all kinds of other discussions, but somebody might pick it up and think it's a very particularly subject oriented, which it is. But it also is a surrogate argument that would be much harder to make excluded from its context or from its detail, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that you also say, and I think really interestingly, that the bibliography is part of the narrative. It's not something that is only a reference. And the set of connection that you can see through the bibliography, you can see the geography and the temporal dimension of this kind of intellectual journey that you are tracing to.
And simply the quantity of material is staggering. For instance, there's a whole generation of this late Ottoman historians that people just either don't know about or don't read. People like Rosanes and all the
Yehuda, you were one of the first ones, the Avram Shalom Yehuda, to mention in your book.
Avram Shalom Yehuda, yeah,
and others. But I think and that's why I discovered him through your book, and then went to my own journey into his work. And I think that part of what you're saying here, I think bibliography have another, of course, a symbolic dimension into it in the 1970s, 80s in Israel, where you reside during the time, because part of the discussion was that the Mizrahi Jews doesn't have intellectual production, doesn't have books, doesn't have a heritage, doesn't have a bibliography in that sense. So part of what you're doing here, first of all, is showing that there is a big and large array of intellectual history and heritage that we need to investigate, and then investigate the connection and not the separation and the ruptures that we put into. So that was, I think, very strong statement in that sense. And I think your book is continued this statement, that is because we still have a lot of work to do about this kind of connection. So most of the things that still in your bibliography are not really investigated yet. And
I find out all kinds of things. A Tunisian friend just sent me Gilbert Nakash, who was a well-known Tunisian intellectual. He just had a stamp in commemoration. He just passed away recently. It's quite vast, and I guess in relation to the original question that you asked is, I haven't followed, closely what has been going on, although I have some awareness. I'm not completely divorced from, because I do readers' reports and I do, things pass me by and I see things. And frankly, I'm not quite sure how to think about what's going on now, because in some sense, it's already now, one could say, second generation of kind of legitimized work where, you're in a university, you're doing this kind of work. I saw Lital is here, is doing that kind of work. Many other people are doing that kind of work and have been doing it for some time. So it's present, it exists, it's there. And I guess the question is, in the urgency with which I was doing it has shifted. And that's a very strange position to be in when one feels an urgency. How can you create an urgency? Urgency doesn't just show up, it has to have conditions. And I'm not sure quite how to think about that. I think it's and I guess this project was one attempt to kind of like, okay, is there a way to inject this material again with some sense of urgency or some, and I felt that very much in speaking about in the seminar we did on Shimon Balas. And just for people who are unaware, Shimon was born in 1930 in Baghdad. He was a very great novelist, who came to Israel in 1951, and he was already a fully formed, young man. And he wrote for the press in Arabic, and he switched to Hebrew. his first novel was about what's called the Transit Camp, and it's a masterpiece. And his novels, I believe, hold a lot of leverage. I spent the summer, because I was supposed to do an event with Sanala Ibrahim, the great Egyptian novelist, and he couldn't do it for one reason or another. But I spent the summer rereading all of Sanala, and I just thought of Shimon in relation to Sanala Ibrahim. I mean, people have no idea who Shimon Balas is, but Shimon created, brought into being characters and worlds that people think don't even exist, are unimaginable, truly. And yet they're very real. So it's a very deceptive kind of work. It seems to be realist, but it's very far from realist. But it is such a key to thinking through a period of the Middle East, and of character and of identity and of politics, that it seems like a tremendous load, LODE, of material. I just want to, before we go on, there's a passage I wanted to read from the Poetics of Bibliography having to do with this idea of experience, okay? The same tension between what is lived and what becomes known through documentary sources is evident throughout After Jews and Arabs and its attendant offshoots, in which daily political events and relationships between actual, quote, Jews, unquote, and actual, quote, Arabs, unquote, and my own experience in and of them became the filter through which the historical knowledge I explored was sifted. Waiting in line at a tiny kiosk for music cassettes from Iraq and Algeria brought back from Paris, seeing a once great musician in tatters begging in the marketplace, watching smoke rise from burning tire barricades near Jerusalem's grim housing projects, taking testimony from imprisoned Palestinian children, seeing people dragged in shackles from the torture chamber just 100 yards from the central post office, standing in vigil with friends whose relatives were starving in the Lebanese camps war because of an Israeli Navy blockade, seeing the collective courage of a truly popular uprising during the first Intifada, all had to be weighed in the balance like the feather of justice with every book or document I encountered. So that was the process, really, of the material that I found had to have a resonance with the experience that I was going through. And so much of it did, I was that allowed me to find things that really had a great power,
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is in this quote exactly is that most of the researchers that would work on Al-Andalusian writing, on Sephardi intellectual work, even early modern work, will try to distance themselves from the cassette music of the Byzantine. They will say this is the opposite of what that was the glory time, and something happened, a rupture happened, and you did the opposite. And you reconnected them. I think that's the powerful thing that you did during the work. And I want to go to another, I think, your major contribution is your translation work. You have translation work from on the context of Kosovo that we won't go into it, but you did a really interesting, and there is a connection. But I would focus on the literary translation, mainly Mizrahi translation, and the anthology Keys to the Gardens, in many ways, that was published in 1996, and was the first anthology of this beautiful book that I'm using a lot in my teaching and writing, and it was the first book of this kind of anthology, not only in English, in Hebrew. Nobody, as you said, some of the writers there never been published even in Hebrew, but never been an anthology like that. So taking this kind of margin. So I'm really curious about what kind of, in a way, after you published this anthology, that opened the way to do a same project in Hebrew for Sami Shalom Shitrit, your friend and my friend, my colleague, to do the same kind of project of 100 poets and writers from, we have something. So it's a continuation, but it came out from the English first. I'm really interested in that kind of, it's a reverse way in a way.
It's very interesting and very ironic, how that worked, because I had hoped, okay, this will open up some avenues for more work to come out in translation. The opposite happened. it was taken back in and allowed people in Israel to make this work available, particularly through that anthology that Sammy and others worked on, the 100 Years, 100 Writers. And that was very important, and I was very gratified to see that. But I was also kind of amazed and shocked. I can't say shocked, but amazed to see the levels of resistance that came out of, there are 24 writers in Keys to the Garden. I believe when I finished it, about 20 or 21 were alive. Okay. And what was fascinating in that process was that I would say no more than a third of them knew of the others. Sometimes these are people who lived in the same city. They lived in Tel Aviv, Somebody knew Tikva Levy as an activist. They didn't know she wrote poetry, or they knew so-and-so as something else, but they had no idea that they wrote novels. So-and-so was a lawyer, but he wrote novels, okay? So for some, not to mention somebody like Yehezkel Kedmi, who was homeless, living behind the central bus station in Jerusalem. And my friend Shelley Elkayam had found him, and so I went to see him, and we became friends and started talking. And so it was very, very scattered and obscure. There was no space, there was no discursive space or physical space that people could meet, literally. And somehow it took, me with the help of many others to put a continuity on this, put a relationship on this, so that people could start thinking about each other and connecting to each other. And, I thought that would have some further, but the one book by Shimon Balas, the book by Samir Nakash came out, Cobwebs and Tenants, that Sadok Masliach worked on for years and years. I know Sinan Antun is working on some more. Very little. Very little. And some of these are really extraordinary writers. So it is. I'll give you an example, which I always bring up. First of all, I put photographs of each writer in the book, because to prove that they exist. Literally. There's Avi Shmuelian, who was running a restaurant in Jerusalem, in which there was no menu and no prices. And he would just serve what he was making that day, and you could pay what you wanted. And he said it kind of worked out in the end. Some people paid more, some paid less. Anyways, he has a wonderful book called Moonstruck Sunflowers, which takes place in right around the First World War in Rafsanjan. And I had a full translation of the book, and I showed it to a very intelligent editor, and the editor loved it. This is fantastic. It's really amazing. It reminds me of Garcia Marquez and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, great. So, and then the editor said, but what does it have to do with Israel? And I was like, it's written in Hebrew. It's it didn't fit a narrative. It didn't fit a narrative and I think it's very important that I published Keys to the Garden and Shimon's book with City Lights, because it removed it from this automatic Jewish, whatever mainstream, where everything is by certain writers is automatically translated, automatically reviewed, automatically lauded, and I think it began to break that blockade a little bit of so that one began to see more, whether Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, some more, lesser known writers appear with smaller presses, to show that this situation in Israel is not as monolithic as one thinks it is. But that process kind of stopped, in a funny way. And I think translation is still very important, very important to.
I feel that your translation as well in English, some of the writers that you deal with are in between languages, and Arabic and Hebrew. Samir Nakash, Shimon Balas, and others. And in the fact, and I think it's the same about the after Jews and Arabs, the English can bring these complexities, and in this kind of the borderland between or the contact zones between the languages. That's what I felt. So in many ways, your first translation of this kind of text into English brought into the light something that maybe only in Hebrew or only in Arabic will miss, this kind of interconnectivity between the languages.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I think it's also a natural function of translation. It's an interpretation. It's a reading. It's another source. It adds another layer. You know, and particularly with some of these. I mean, for instance, an extraordinary poet, Moshe Sartel. Moshe Sartel is a world poet. I mean, and he's completely, like unknown. I mean, he's somebody who can put in class with George Seferis or Yanis Ritsos, or, you know, but the typical Israeli thing is to immediately compare, you know, somebody to an Anglo-American, you know, or a European, not to a Greek or a Lebanese or an Egyptian or a Sudanese or a Mauritanian or a Moroccan, you know, where they make sense. You know, and that's one of the problems with Shimon Bala's interpretation of Shimon Bala's. You have to read Shimon next to Yusuf Idris, next to Sonala Ibrahim, next to writers like that. Then it becomes, you know, it becomes comprehensible.
Angie, do you have any?
Yeah, I wanted to. It's a completely different question. So it's maybe moving away from these questions. It's a very general thought that I had after reading after Jews and Arabs, and it has to do with the question of in-betweenness. So you subtitled the book "Remaking Levantine Culture," which is, I mean, I assume this is also a reference, the use of the word Levantine, to Jacqueline Kahanoff. And I was wondering, Kahanoff sees this in-betweenness, this being in between cultures, and in between languages, and in between historical times, and in between speeds, historical speeds also, as something that is characteristic of a Levantine culture. And she sees this as a model even. So I'm wondering what you think about this, the possibility of this in-betweenness today, because I have the feeling that this in-betweenness requires high tolerance to ambiguity, that it's almost not existent today in times of identity politics, where everybody has to have the right ideas. And then the question is whether someone's ideas align with your own in order to be able to support them, or endorsements. We endorse people now. You don't need to read them or discuss them or wrestle with them. You either endorse someone or don't endorse someone. And the idea of being in between worlds as a valid cultural aspiration, in my opinion, requires also a community that is willing to be together without needing to define each other along identity lines and along very clear-cut definitions. And I'm wondering what you think about that today, like almost 30 years after. Things don't look good for Levantine culture. And
it's a great question. I mean, I'll say a few things. First of all, the remaking Levantine culture was a reference to both the positive and the pejorative usage. You know, the David Ben Gurion, you know, we're going towards Levantinization, the idea of which is, you know, people partake of some surface aspect of many cultures and are not in depth in any one, which is a very, stupid way of looking at things, I think. But
Yeah.
and the Jacqueline Kanoff conceptualization of that region. Now, in some sense, we're all everywhere and nowhere at this point, in a digital world, and with the economics of globalism, which is killing everybody, some more slowly, some more quickly. So it's very ironic. I've spent a lot of time over the last 6 or 8 months Zooming with a friend in Gaza, even more, the last year, I think. And we worked on a book together. He's a young poet, Mossab Abu Toha, and the City Lights is bringing out his book, which is extraordinary. And I helped him edit it and did an interview with him at the end of the book. And it was quite an experience to, they've been under lockdown for, over a decade. So, this so-called pandemic, is not really on the top of their priority list. So it was very instructive to both feel and intuit and experience the parameters of the world that can be accessed from their vantage point. Let's put it that way. Okay. Now, in some sense, that is where the globalists want us all to be, locked down, with very small parameters. There's no question about that, I think. Any other way of thinking about it would be naive. So we're all in some sense in this difficulty, and in that sense, I think that it's very important to investigate, pronounce, and fully explore this world and these identities, because I've been having a really interesting exchange with Tzvi Ben-Dor and Moshe Behar, Shiko Behar, about this letter that was signatories about the exhibit at the Institut du Monde Arabe. So I won't get into the whole thing, but anyways, I've been having a very great exchange about it and their thoughts on it. And these identity things are complicated. They're not simple. When Shimon Ballas declared, "I'm an Arab Jew," people, he said, like, where, so what's wrong with that? Where do they think I'm from? The moon? I'm from Iraq. His extraordinary response to Gershon Shaked, who the mainstream Israeli critic, who finally, deigned to put him and Sami Michael and a few other people in the category of protest novelists. And Shimon wrote a great article called Rehabilitation or Libel. Rehabilitation or libel. And he said that all of his attitudes, it's one of the best responses to racism I've ever seen. His response was, everything that I do is determinant upon my identity. So I have no agency, really. Okay, that's really what it comes down to. And so the question then is, what agency will people embrace or take within the constraints that are being foisted on us in all ways? And so I think one has to see, how people respond to these very, as you've said, these very clear-cut binaries. You're this or you're that. How do people respond to create, as Raja Shahada quoted, a third way of seeing things? And I think it's very important to be very vigilant about that and to constantly question and interrogate and bring up examples of things that don't fit. There's also a question, in the Israeli context, there's also a question of provincialism. Somebody like Nissim Rejwan. Nissim Rejwan was, he managed, as a young man, he managed a bookshop in Baghdad called the Arabita Bookshop. which was a hangout for a lot of the major modernists, people like Bulund al-Haidari and Jabra Ibrahim Jabra and other people. And he was writing book reviews in the Baghdad Times, in the 1940s, and he comes to Israel, and he's like, "What is this?" It was a complete. He felt it was very constraining. Same thing when Shimon, when he first started writing for the Al-Ittihad, the communist newspaper, he said, "I couldn't believe it. These were people prominent in the party who had no idea about the structure of the neighboring country, like none." So part of that pile up of detail in After Jews and Arabs is to get that texture. Like, no, these people have their experiences, they have knowledges, they have references that are very dense.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting, and maybe then open for discussion with the audience. Just to say that it's really the last example that you brought, Nissim Majwan and definitely Shimon Balaz, both of them are multilingual as well. And coming to Israel Palestine, they were damned to be either Arab, working with Arabic or Hebrew, even though Nissim Majwan was writing English most of his life and felt more comfortable writing English. And Shimon Balaz could be in a different life, be an intellectual in Paris, an Arab intellectual in Paris, working with French and maybe in Arabic and between languages. And even with the interview with you in the book is talking about this option. So it's another thing about this kind of what Angie was talking about, in betweenness, is to be in multiple languages and not in this binary of either Arab or Hebrew that happens in Israel, Palestine, because of the conflict, because of, this kind of Jews coming from an Arab land. So when they come into Israel, even if they being socialized into the elite, they need to be now expert of Arab world, like what happened with Shimon Balaz, in that sense.
It's true to a certain extent for all the languages that came to Israel. I mean, it's a fantastic line in a poem by Avod Yeshurun, where at some point he says, did I come to the homeland or to escape from my father? Nobody asked that question before, It's a very important question.
Yes. Okay, so maybe
should we open to questions?
Sure.
Yeah. So let's see, because
I'm not even going to look at the chat. I'll concentrate on. Is the idea you'll read something?
So Professor Sabrina Parrish is managing the chat.
Okay, great.
And she's going to. Yeah.
I'm going to start off with a couple of comments that have come through the chat and then move on to some questions. We've got a couple of comments just expressing general interest. Agnes Klein writes, "This is very interesting. I grew up in Europe, and what I was always informed was that the Mizrahi and Sephardi Jewish culture was deemed to be far stronger and better than the Ashkenazi one. This is what my late father drilled into us." Jen Hardy, in a similar vein, writes, "Thank you so much for this wonderful program. I lived in Afghanistan and Iran from 1971 through post-revolution in 1979. To have access to a bibliography of Mizrahi works is indeed a treasure. Thank you so much." And I'll start off with a couple of questions. Shayna Weiss asks, "You all touched a bit on this already, but I'm curious about the role of America in these Sephardic identities. I just listened to an excellent episode of Shir Ahad podcast with Alon Olearchik, former member of Kaveret, and he discussed his time in New York after the legendary band broke up. He says, almost as an aside, that he could not appreciate Mizrahi music until he left Israel. And it wasn't until he ran a New York City nightclub in the 1970s that featured Mizrahi musicians that he could really appreciate this grand tradition of music. Of course, many of us are based in North America, and many of these thinkers have links to America, either by writing in English for American audiences, such as Kana for being part of the North American Academy, as we are. How did the American context affect this tradition? How does it affect us today? So we'll start off with that, and I would ask the audience to please continue sending your questions, and if you'd like to ask something directly, just let me know in your chat and just say that you have a question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Well, I mean, obviously, it's the big elephant in the room. I mean, you know, it's the imperial language, it's the dominant superpower, and all of that. So it dwarfs many other things, and obviously the U.S., the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel, um, is a big factor. And in addition, you know, I would say that because the U.S. doesn't have a direct colonial antecedent, there's a very different context or background. For instance, in France or in the UK, there's a whole back catalog of knowledge and common knowledge and specialized knowledge and available materials, whether it's in film or books or music, you know, that people have some idea about. You know, they have some idea about it. It isn't completely like news to them. So that's one thing. But you know, it does play a huge. It plays a huge role. It plays a huge role. I mean, this isn't to say that there aren't, you know, various pockets. I mean, for instance, that research that I mentioned, the 1,200 pages or so of transcribed material that was when I, you know, when it was condensed, and that there was one little article in English. There was a lot of it was translated into French and Arabic immediately, and had a lot of circulation and a lot of impact. So that's kind of indicative on one sense, you know. On the other sense, I totally understand, like the anecdote that you tell, that somebody would open up in this environment and, you know, begin to feel like whatever they're bringing is worth something. That would be validating. So yeah.
There's a couple of questions that kind of have a similar gist, so I'm gonna try to put them together. The bibliography in part is such a great resource because many of these oral histories writings remain inaccessible to a broader audience. How does one go about the work of connecting a broader audience to these sources?
You know, I don't know. I very much subscribe to the concept of Peter Dale Scott, who's a poet but was also a diplomat and a scholar. Has this concept which has become bandied about normally now by everybody, particularly on the conservative side, the deep state. He has this concept of deep politics, and you know, I believe that there are for instance, okay, I was very involved in translating works that emerged from the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, and particularly the siege of Bosnia. Now, at the same time that was going on in those years, there was a horrendous war going on in Algeria. Okay, and the Algerian material was there's there's very little. You know, there is stuff, but nothing comparable to what emerged from Bosnia, because obviously Bosnia is in Europe. Okay, so people looked at it and said, well, yeah, that's like around the corner, you know, and Algeria is a little bit further away. So we can kind of, you know, put a damper on it. So I think, you know, it's hard. I don't really have an answer to that. I don't have an answer to that. I don't believe in. I have issues with like big audiences. I think that the audiences come one by one, and they accumulate, and at a certain point, the thing is established. It becomes, you know, it becomes present. And can be a very long process.
Gloria Balin in the chat asks, you said something very important about looking at the writing of Mizrahi Sephardi writers as a way from Eurocentric analysis. As a university professor in literature, how do you go about it?
Well, it's been many years since I've taught this material, but when I first started teaching at Queens College, Queens College has kind of, you know, Queens is the contemporary Ellis Island. It's just every 5 or 8 years, we get a whole new immigration, At that, there was a point of about 5 or 7 years where there were a lot of children of Israelis who were going to Queens College. So I could actually teach a class, an upper level Hebrew class, and read 3 or 4 novels in a semester in Hebrew for undergraduates. This was unheard of in the US at the time. I mean, I spoke to colleagues around the country, and a lot of them were Mizrahi, some were not, but they were astounded at encountering this material. They were completely astonished that it existed, that they'd never heard of it, that, if they felt like it explained their life to some extent. And it was an amazing laboratory in a way for how I selected, Keys to the Garden, because I was teaching that material constantly and seeing how people reacted and responded to it. Presently, I mean, my attitude is just to, I put it all on the table, whatever I can bring to students, put it all on the table and find out, what are the things that interest them, and push them, direct them towards sources that they wouldn't have encountered, from wherever they come. And yeah. I don't have a method, it's like.
Yedgar Yaakov in the chat asks, the realities you retrace and resurrect in your work have obviously been victims of nation status politics. Do they offer an alternative to this politics? Is there a viable Arab Jew political vision that transcends the nation state?
I would say probably not until Palestine is a state. And then there might be a way to transcend it. You can't transcend something when everybody has a state except the Palestinians. But again, when I point to this period that I'm talking about, there was of course, the forces militating against any kind of actual person-to-person solution were and are still enormous. But on the ground, there was an enormous, amongst the actual people, amongst the population, there was an enormous swell of possibility, between the Intifada, between what was happening with the Mizrahim. I think of a type that hasn't been seen since, and it was not seen before. And in a way, if you know the end of After Jews and Arabs, it is a bit of mourning. It's not a happy ending, I do feel like a chapter closes there. So I'm not particularly optimistic on that front.
I'm going to take a moment to just open up the conversation to the rest of the audience. If you would like to just
I have maybe a thought regarding what Yaakov Yadgar just asked. I won't say maybe alternative to nation state, but I will say that the people that you are working on, the writers, the activists, the intellectual history that you're working on doesn't fit nation state boundaries in that sense. So even though their own existence is already alternative to nation state, if we're talking about Shimon Balas, if we're talking about Samir Makash, we'll talk about Nissim Rajwan and others that are only working on their material, and your interpretation of their work already does this work, but definitely your project is challenging geographical boundaries and temporal one, but definitely I think only their own existence of their work, and if you want really to grasp, and that's what Gershon Shaked doesn't do with Shimon Balas, is only reading him under the boundaries or the framework of the nation state. So in the nation state, he is like the ethnic writer, the Sofer Adati, or the one that they bring protest, but he doesn't read his work outside of this kind of framework.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great point. Absolutely. And, I mean, we have similar problems in the US. I mean, ethnic writers. I mean, why is somebody an ethnic writer and not a writer? I mean, why? You know, I mean, I suggested at one point, my department at Queens is my home department is classical, Middle Eastern, and Asian. We have programs in Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, Greek, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Arabic. And it's pretty unique for an undergraduate department. And I remember when I was the chair at some point, something came up with the English department. And I said, well, you know, I mean, they were languages were on the chopping block, you know. And I said, well, you know, English is also a language, you know. I mean, you could call yourself, you know, the Department of Anglo-Saxon Ethnic Studies just as well, you know. It as opposed, you know, but it does serve an imperial function in the curriculum. The English department determines the humanities curriculum, and that's what it is, you know. And most people within it are blind to that. And so they can have ethnic writers, you know, who are slotted into diversity.
Vanessa Elbaz asks in the chat, I spent 10 years doing oral histories of Jews in Morocco until 2018, and have found that both Muslim and Jewish Moroccans outside of Morocco have found these very powerful. I can imagine that there would be a lot of interest in younger generations hearing the oral histories you did in the 80s. Are they archived anywhere? Are they available to researchers and others to listen to?
I wish. I have no idea. You know, this was done on cassette tapes with very low budget. I gave all those tapes to Hila, which is the organization that Tikva Levy was one of the founders of, which was a grassroots organization to fight discrimination in the Israeli educational system. And there was like a box of cassettes and, you know, a bunch of paper. So, you know, I don't know. I have a few of the interviews. It by chance, it happened that we did an interview with Mordechai Vanunu before he was arrested, which is extraordinary because we published that as part of, hopefully part of his defense. They wouldn't admit it because he talked about growing up in Morocco and, you know, how he felt very free as a kid and, you know, and how he got involved in politics. We wanted to use it as a means of showing that he didn't, you know, they claimed he was doing this for money, he was taking advantage. And we said, no, he had a political position always as a student at Beersheba and prior to that. So it was a tremendous interview. I mean, it was just tremendous. But unfortunately, I'm going to consider those, better that I consider them lost than I try to think of trying to retrieve them because I don't think they're retrievable. Which is unfortunate. I do have somewhere buried in my piles of stuff in the office in Queens. I do have the publication in Arabic and the publication in French, which does have a lot of quotes. You know, the publication in French, both of them were pretty substantial. I think probably 40, 50 pages. So there's some sense of the whole thing. That I can say that I can just say, Vanessa, that who knows if that's retrievable, but you might be able to, the one in French was published in Perspective Judeo-Arabe. I would say somewhere around 1986 or so.
It looks like Vanessa has a follow-up question.
Yeah, I was so excited hearing about these interviews that I think that I would love to get an address for the person that you gave it to and kind of follow the rabbit hole, because we can digitize this stuff.
I'll ask the person who might know is Sami Shetrit. I'll check with Sami and see if he might.
Maybe Moshe Behar as well. There is a chance. He's really into this kind of archives, and I think he followed Tikva Levy's things.
I'll ask Shiko and see if he knows. I'll ask a few people, and Vanessa, you can find me easily, you know, through the Queens or just, yeah. Send me an email.
I will. Thank you.
Sure.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? You can either put your name in the chat, or you can just raise your hand using the Zoom function.
Yeah, I think Yaron Shemel wanted to write something, but maybe he accidentally hit send without.
Yeah, hello everyone. Sorry. I had some issues with the keyboard. Good to see all of you. Good to see you, Ammiel. I'm sorry. I just wanted to write 3 words. Also, Ella Shohat, she was a very close friend of Tiki. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say.
Of course, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I knew Ella when she was finishing her doctorate, you know, at NYU before her book came out, and yeah, absolutely, we were on the same wave. Thanks, Yaron.
Yeah, I think that with Ella Shohat, it's another example of scholarship on Sephardi Mizrahi intellectual history that was published in English first, then into Hebrew.
Right.
She wrote about the Israeli cinema, but also on, of course, vast issues on Sephardi. So it's maybe going back to the question of why in English, and why English was the place that in New York, or the place that you were part of.
Yeah, I mean, I think partially there was a certain, I think there is a certain disciplinary freedom that is available at the graduate level that is harder in other systems. You know, that's probably changed. But, you know, the ironic thing is, after Jews and Arabs, I even with major support from important people, has not been translated into any, you know, Juan Goiti Solo tried to get it published in Spanish, which is absurd that it's not in Spanish. I have a friend who's been trying in Italian for many years. Same thing in
What
French.
happened with that translation by Juan Goiti Solo?
No, it wasn't his trend. He was just trying to push it, you know, and it wasn't never translated. But
I heard it's being translated into Hebrew now.
Really, it's news to
A
me.
friend of mine, who's a translator, told me that she received an offer and
Really?
that she was very busy and unfortunately had to turn it down. And she knows that someone else took it. This is a conversation I had in Madrid 3 days ago. So I know this.
That's
for
fantastic.
A fact.
I'll email you. I would like to know more about that. I have no
yeah,
idea.
I'll put you in touch with the person that told me.
That's really good news. Of course, one of the difficult things about translating that book is half of it is like an anthology. I mean, there's an enormous amount of original material in there from different languages, you know. So, but luckily, a lot of it is from Hebrew. So, you know, that would help. You're on mute.
Yeah. We have a comment from Miriam Hoffman in the chat. Excellent talk and illuminating material names and events. I wonder how all this Sephardi Jewish studies can be penetrated to Jewish day schools in America or Israel as well, so the younger generation should be open to it. It is about time kids should know about their parents' experiences and rich culture.
Very good question. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. There's a famous, a good friend, Miro Gal, who's a visual artist, has an extraordinary piece, which is himself holding up the required Israeli history book, and he's holding the pages on Mizrahi Jews. I think it's 3 pages in like a
9 out of 400. 9 out of 400.
9 out of 400. Yeah, it's such a brilliant piece. So I know that some things have changed since then, but yeah, I don't know what to tell you on that.
Definitely, I think the question of more accessibility is very important. But then now there is more writing, but then you ask what kind of writing they include, and what kind of writing, what kind of narratives are being pushed forward, and what kind of narratives are still marginalized. It's still a big question. Debate.
Yeah, there's still, you know, I think there's still tremendous pressure on any, you know, non-Zionist narrative. That there's tremendous pressure on it. So, somebody like Samir Nakash, whose whole life basically was trying to figure out how to leave Israel. I mean, Samir Nakash is somebody, his father died of a stroke in the transit camp. And before that happened, he was an activist. He was organizing other people, and he was trying to communicate with international bodies to say, wait a second, we're refugees. I have the right to go wherever I want. I should be able to go to England or wherever I want. But they were captive. They couldn't go anywhere but to Israel. And so Samir, I think he was 16. He and a relative walked over the border into Lebanon. They were captured at some point and imprisoned, and kind of lost for a while until some judge who knew Samir's mother heard about it, and they retrieved him somehow. After that, he moved to Bombay. He moved to Tehran. He was in contact with his father's former business partner in Baghdad. He wanted to move back to Baghdad, and then there was a coup. He couldn't do that. He moved to Manchester, to England. He moved to Cairo for a while, and then he still ended up in Petah Tikva, in the apartment built upon the transit camp that he arrived at. So, yeah. So that's a narrative that would be hard to swallow, because it's unimaginable. It's not imaginable. It's not, people would say, no, this is a fantasy. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, but I think it's definitely something that we can speak about, that there is no one way of leaving home and going to other place, like in the narrative that we also, definitely in Israel, but I think not only of Israel, of immigrants living home, but not really thinking about returning. Not physically. So in a way, Samir Nakash is not only symbolically trying to go back, like Shimon Balas. Most of his novels are in many ways Iraqi novels, even though he's sitting in Tel Aviv, but also physically trying to go back to these places of community of Iraqis in London and other places.
I'm sorry to come back to children and young generation, but I think that this kind of story is exactly what teenagers love to hear. All those people that have amazing life stories and being creatively writers, poets, painters, Machshevet Israel writers, these are the people that have to be exposed to the young generations. And that's what we need to do. Otherwise, it will continue in the same obscurity that you are trying to unravel. Who is going to know? Once, Ammiel, I wish you good long life, but after that, who is going to do your work?
There's a tremendous film that you should try to find by an Iraqi filmmaker who just goes by his first name, Samir, called Forget Baghdad, which is a portrayal of Shimon Balas, Samir Nakash, Sami Michael, and a few other people. Ella Shohat is in it. Musa Khoury. It's an extraordinary film. It's absolutely, and it will touch anybody because it's a very, it's very particular, but it's very universal just to hear each of their stories. And the story of the filmmaker whose father had been involved in the Communist Party in Iraq, and the son, they grew up in Switzerland, they grew up in Dusseldorf, I think. And the son kept asking his father, how do I find out more about this? And at some point his father said, son, I'm afraid you're going to have to go to Israel because that's where the ones that remain are. So he takes this journey and he meets these people, and it's just a fantastic film. Very effective too for.
So I am from a Moroccan descent, and only at my older years that I became interested in my background. But I do know that right now in Israel and here in America, there is so much going on in opening up Moroccan culture. And this should be done for other other places as well, here and everywhere.
You know,
Anyway, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really wonderful.
sure. Thanks. The Morocco is a bit of a special case just because the more people left later, so the connections are not as tenuous, and a community remained. There's always been a community in Morocco. They didn't,
Well, I left when I was a baby at 48. So, it depends.
But people stayed until the early 60s. So, and other people just stayed. They didn't leave. I had the opportunity extraordinarily, I don't know if the name Abraham Sarfati means anything to anyone. Abraham Sarfati was a mining engineer, basically, and he was an anti-Zionist Jewish, and he worked with a group of writers and poets who started a magazine called Souf Anfas that started in the late 60s with Abdel Latif Labi, who's a friend and a poet who lives in France. And Abraham was the longest political prisoner in Africa except for Mandela. And his case wasn't very well known in the US because it was meant to be that way, although in Europe it was quite well known. But I corresponded with him while he was in prison. And the extraordinary thing was, when I first wrote to him, I was shocked to get a letter back. And he said, "I'm so happy to hear from you because I've been reading your articles in Merit, Middle East Reports," which I was completely flabbergasted that was even possible. This was in his late prison where he was in better condition. But, people also don't know the political diversity of Jewish life in those countries, and involvement and very wide ranging, from people very high up in government to dissidents to, yeah.
Well, there are still a couple more questions and comments, and they're all really interesting. Maybe Ammiel, you can have a quick look at them now. But we really have to finish because we need to to respect the time frame that we marked for ourselves. So I just want to, first,
I just want to say I'm reading this Vanessa's post here. I was at Sarfati's funeral in Casablanca. That's quite extraordinary. It was through his wife Christine that I got in touch with him, and so yeah, wow.
So thank you very much, Ammiel. First of all,
for having me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was fascinating, and thank you everybody for your participation. And I just want to remind you all that the next seminar will be on February 9th, and it will be led by Lital Levy, and the title is Esther Mouyal, Émile Zola, and Alfred Dreyfus, an Arab Jewish feminist on the affair that rocked the world. So Professor Lital Levy will be our next speaker. We hope to see you all there.